All right, it's time for us to get started. Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our S3 webinar, Transitioning from the Lab to the Business Side of Science. Our speaker for today's presentation is Bill Arteca, the Scientific Solutions Lead from Sanguine. We're going to be taking questions later on in the webinar, so you can submit your questions using the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And now, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Bill Arteca.
Thank you so much. So we'll get kicked off. So as she mentioned, my name is Bill Arteca. I'm the Scientific Solutions Lead at Sanguine. I've been at Sanguine for about a year at this point. However, I have had a pretty long career before this in both the lab and the business side of science. And today I want to kind of describe what the transition of that looks like, give you guys a little bit of an idea of kind of what the positions out there might be available to you for those who are working in a lab and might be considering leaving, and also just some key takeaways and experiences that I've had during my transition out of a laboratory into the more business commercial side of science. So for the agenda, first we're going to start with a little bit on my background just to kind of give you guys, a little bit of kind of how I got to where I am today in regard to the different career paths that I've taken. And then we'll move over to my actual decision to switch careers and my decision to leave the laboratory into the more business side of science and kind of some of the factors that built into that. And I'm sure that you guys will be able to relate to a few of them for those of you who are considering that transition. We'll then move on to the job search and available career options. So I know in the scientific industry, there are some, there's a little bit of gray area in terms of what you can actually do with a scientific degree outside of a laboratory. So I always want to shed a little bit of light onto what those positions are and what are some things that you can expect once you start that job search. Then we'll move on to the actual transition itself. Well, then I'll share some harsh realities that I had during that transition. Then I'll move on to some pleasant realities that I had during transition. And then lastly, we'll finish up with some of the perks of the commercial science space, and then some takeaways that I've kind of gathered throughout the entire process and throughout my entire career. So without further ado, let's begin. By the way, this presentation should take about a half hour. At that point, we'll open it up for questions and I'll answer any questions that you guys have. So please just write them in the chat as mentioned before. So in terms of background, I actually began my scientific career relatively early. I was one of those people, and I'm sure most of you are the same way, where you kind of knew that science was your calling from a young age. So as soon as I turned 16 and you were able to legally work, I got an internship at a laboratory. I essentially was just kind of filing papers in the basement for them, but it was as close as I could possibly get to a laboratory. Now, after that, I worked there in high school, kind of gained some knowledge and just, was around laboratory equipment. And then after that, I went and actually gained my MS in molecular biology, as well as a minor in quantitative chemistry. Now, from that moment on, I spent about 6 years in the laboratory. My first job was in the Durham Research Center of New York. That was a stage 3 clinical trial facility. I then moved on to Eaton Bioscience, which was more of a commercial focused organization where they did DNA sequencing, and then they would send it back to clients. And then lastly, I spent about 2 or 3 years at Crescenta Bioscience, which was my first kind of true scientific research job. My job title there was research scientist, just like many of yours are. And that was where I'd go into the lab every day, perform, design, and execute experiments in the space of drug discovery. I performed translational research with the goal of improving treatment and finding new drugs for both the treatment of diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. As we know, they are both caused by acute inflammation. So we were trying to find a mechanism of action that could potentially treat both with our compounds. Now, after I left the laboratory, I've had about 5 years experience in the commercial science space. Now, when I say commercial science, I put a lot of thought into what term I want to use for that. And I didn't really like the word like business science. It doesn't flow as well. So I just use the word commercial science. So whenever I say that, don't take it as it's only you're selling equipment. That's just my general term that I use for just the general business side of science as a whole. There is no real good terminology to capture that. However, when I was there, or I am here, however, for the past 5 years, I've worked at House Corporation that sells scales, balances, and laboratory equipment. Then I worked at GenScript, and GenScript does a variety of different things. They have DNA sequencing. They'll sequence your peptides. They could do HLA typing. So they do a lot of different things and a lot of different services there. And then lastly, I ended up at Sanguine Bioscience, which is where I am today. I've been here for the past year, and I really couldn't be happier here. It's an excellent place to work. Additionally, for the past 2 years, I have been a professor at King University. I teach both graduate cellular techniques as well as undergraduate biochemistry. Now the position's held. Now we can really start to really kind of dig into it. So the position's held. So when I was in a laboratory, I was a research assistant. I've been a laboratory technician. I've been a lab manager, and I've been a true outright research scientist. So I've pretty much done everything that you can do in a laboratory, minus being an actual principal investigator. On the commercial side, I've been a sales support scientist. I've been an account executive. I've been a customer success manager, and I've been a scientific solutions lead, which is what I am currently today. Now, for all of those titles on the commercial side, I'm actually going to kind of go through those in the next couple slides and really give you an idea of what those mean and what those jobs entail in terms of how you would use your scientific acumen that you've developed to help further your career outside of a laboratory. But before we do that, let's get into a little bit of kind of my mindset when I first got out of college, or really when I was in college and I was committing to a life of science and what I thought I was going to go into and what ended up being the reality. Now, before I begin, I do want to mention that there might be some times in here where it sounds like I'm advocating to not work in a laboratory. That is not the case. If it comes off like that, I apologize. I did love working in a laboratory when I did. It just wasn't for me, and I'll kind of reveal why. However, for those of you who are in a laboratory, if you love it, definitely stay with it. And if you're here just to learn some more information, all the better. But please don't think that I'm trying to sway you one way or the other. I just like to present the facts and hopefully give some clarity for those of you who are considering the transition. So the expectations versus reality of working in a lab. I'm sure for those of you who do work in a lab right now, you're probably going to relate to almost all of these. The first one, expectation, when I was, when you get out of college, you get your first kind of real lab job, and your expectation is that you're going to have standard working hours. So you're going to go to a lab at 9, maybe go to a lab at 8, get out at 4 or 5. That is not the reality. Typically, as you guys know, when you begin a scientific career, the experiments tell you when to work. So I've worked weekends, I've worked night shifts. When I was in a lab, I've pretty much gone in and out of the lab as I needed to, as the experiments needed to be completed. Another expectation that I had was that aha moments happen every day. That might be something that I just kind of picked up from cinema. Obviously, when you watch movies and you watch people in a laboratory, from the time they have an idea to the time they solve the problem entirely is about 3 minutes. In reality, it's like, what, 12 years maybe? So it is a little bit of a skew there. And then the reality of that is that really you're not having any aha moments. You have pretty much consistent failure of experiments until you get 1 or 2 that work and you move on with that. I had one aha moment in my career. We were testing our novel compounds in mice and it actually worked. And we watched the video of the mice and it was incredible. That was really the first and only aha moment I had. So I did experience it in a laboratory, but the majority of my time was redoing failed experiments. That's just how it is. Now, another expectation I had was that I'm an expert from day one. For those of you who work in a lab, I'm sure when you got out of school, when you got out of with either your master's, your PhD, or your undergraduate degree, you came out and you thought to yourself, hell yeah, I just passed all of these difficult classes. I have my degree, time to start my career. Then you get into the laboratory and you realize that even though you're an expert in the areas that you were educated on, there's still a lot more learning left to be done. And you're always learning in the laboratory. You're always improving your skill sets. Now that proves true across almost any industry, but in science specifically, there is a little bit of a gap between those who just started their career and those who are 15 years in terms of knowledge and the knowledge base that you have. Now, another expectation that I had was unlimited budget. Again, I think this kind of falls back to my love of movies and what they show you in the cinema as a kid. Whenever they're doing scientific research in the movies, it always seems like they have this super high-end equipment and they can do anything with it and money isn't an issue. As we know in the real world, money in fact, and the reality of it, money in fact does not grow on trees. So the experiments that you want to perform have to be approved by the budgeting department and the procurement department. The things that you want to do, even though you want to do them, you might just not have the budget for them, or you might not even win the grant to begin the project in the first place. So that was another harsh reality for myself when I realized that every time I failed an experiment, I cost the company about maybe a couple $100 depending on the experiment that you're performing. So that was something. These were kind of the realities that I faced from day one. However, these aren't really the main reasons why I left the laboratory. I'm going to get into that on the next slide. So my moment of clarity. So before I get into this, I want to mention that If any of you relate to any of these moments of clarity, maybe it is time for you to start, thinking about the transition from the lab to the business side of science. However, it can be different for everyone. This was just my personal experience and what I, ended up kind of experiencing that caused me to have that definitive moment that I said, okay, time to explore other options. So really it began with small mistakes and moments of mental lapse. I would had procedural failure in experiments, and then I had some mental lapses during routine work resulting in experimental errors. To give you an example of that, I kind of found myself zoning out during experiments because I wasn't as mentally engaged as I should have been. So when I was at Crescenta specifically, for the first year and a half, I was very mentally engaged. Everything was perfect. My experimental technique was great. As I kind of began to lose interest or began to lose motivation, I think is a better word, I started to make stupid mistakes. These mistakes include, while I was running an ELISA or while I was labeling tubes, I would think about something else for half a second and then go back and forget which tube I was on. For those of you who work in a lab and have done this, you know how much of a pain that is and how disheartening it is when you're labeling 96 tubes or 96 wells and you realize you missed one and have to go back and restart or relabel all of the tubes. So it was moments like that that began slowly, but became more and more frequent in my life, not because I wasn't trying hard, it was because I was just mentally not as into the work as I was. Now, as time went on, that progressed into a true kind of lack of motivation. This is when I really started to realize that it was time for me to explore other job opportunities. I think going into the lab every day, I slowly started to not resent, going to the lab every day, but I started to resent the lack of kind of social involvement. For those of you who work in a lab, I'm sure you do speak to people, but you're not speaking to people as much as you would in other industries. And in the lab I was in, it was relatively small. There were only 3 of us who were in the lab full time. And if one or two of them wasn't there were days where I spent the entire, 8-9 hours of that day in that laboratory alone. So that kind of led to a lack of motivation, kind of led to a yearning to be outside. My lab had big windows, and in the summer, I would look outside at the grass and I would say, man, I want to be out there. But I couldn't because I had to monitor the experiments, monitor the cells. I also desired a more social working environment. I started to, as I said before, I started to want to communicate with people a little bit more, and I started wanting to talk to people a little bit more. And then lastly, I had just a general decrease in work ethic. So before this, it was mental lapses. And then this kind of is when it became a true decrease in my willingness to work. Given I was doing these things, I didn't want to hinder myself career-wise. And I wanted to make sure I was providing to the company that was paying my salary, but my overall work ethic was not as strong as it could be and as strong as it was prior to that. So this kind of all culminated into a singular moment. And in that moment, I knew that it was time to leave because I was making mistakes that were irreparable. So my mistake actually was, and for those of you who work in a laboratory, you're going to read this and realize immediately how terrible it is. I left a -80 degree freezer open overnight, resulting in massive sample loss. We acquired these samples and cultured the cells and differentiated the cells and performed all these experiments on these samples over the course of 2 years. I left the -80 open, and we unfortunately lost about half of them, if not more, because immediately after that, I finished that day's work and then I resigned that day. Given, my boss wasn't too happy. However, I did resign that day because at that point, I kind of knew mentally that it was time to leave and explore other options. I had nothing else lined up. I did not know what the future held for me outside of a laboratory. All I knew is that I loved science, but I didn't want to be in a laboratory, and I was going to find a way to go forward with that path. So with that said, I'll kind of get into what that path looks like. So I began with a new frontier, commercial science. So with that new frontier, the first thing I did, I actually decided to go 3 months unemployed. This was a little bit of a risk on my end. When you get out of college, I got my apartment. I thought I was pretty set financially, and then it just, obviously it ended up not liking the lab. So I decided to go a couple months without a paycheck. So it was a little bit of a strenuous time, but I'm glad I did it because it I learned a lot in that time. So during that time, some of the lessons that I learned, and while I applied for just about every position possible, is that a lot can be done outside of a lab with a scientific degree. On the next slide, I'll go through some of the different sections you can get into, but a scientific degree is the best way to describe it. And what I always tell my students when they ask is that a scientific degree is basically like a crack in the door. And then when you open that door, whether or not you go left or right or center or wherever is up to you. But that scientific degree is what gets that door open in the first place. And then I also had an immediate realization that science is a language that only those with training can speak. This is something that was a pretty cool realization, but also a scary realization. And I think the reason for that is because when you decide to have a career in science, as most of you know, when you enter a company, when you enter school freshman year, you go through grad school, maybe you go for your PhD, and then you get into a laboratory. From the time you're a freshman in college to the time you graduate and begin your career, and even after that, you're surrounded by other scientists and you're surrounded by other students who are going for the same degree, and you're surrounded by people who speak science. It's not until I actually left the laboratory and I was interviewing for jobs where I was only, one of maybe 2 scientists on a staff of 100, where that's where you realize that science is almost like an entirely different language in which those who are trained on it can speak, and those who are not trained on it might have an understanding, but they're not going to be as competent in you in that sense. So that was a pretty interesting realization, and I'll get into kind of what that means and how that helps your career going forward in the next couple slides. Lastly, your knowledge is your most valuable asset. Your knowledge, as I said before, it's something that science is something that if you're not trained on, it's difficult to pick up. You can't really teach yourself science with an online course. You can teach yourself some things, but you need to be in a lab. You need to be hands-on. You need to see how cells react. You need to see a genetic sequence. You need to see a primer dimer and adjust and all these different things. So your knowledge is the most valuable asset when you're searching for a job. Not really anything you've done beforehand, just what you know. And then lastly, communication skills are of the utmost importance. And this, I cannot stress enough. This has been something that I learned immediately in the beginning when I searched for jobs. And even to this day, it is still one of the most important skill sets that I've had to put significant time into developing. Now, I have down here a quote, which is actually from an old mentor of mine when I was at Crescenta. And he turned to me and he said, "Bill, the mark of a great scientist is the ability to explain science to someone who knows nothing at all about it," which I think still holds true to this day. I think when if you do a research paper and if you do a scientific experiment and you explain it to another scientist, you can get into extreme detail. You can use those buzzwords, you can use that vocabulary. But if you explain it to someone who has absolutely no interest in science and maybe their last biology course was senior year of high school, that's where there is going to be a little bit of a communication disconnect when you start using that more scientific specific vocabulary. So being able to communicate scientific ideas with people who don't know science is probably one of the most important skill sets that I've acquired and that I've continually built. So that's something that I learned right off the bat, still developing, and I'll get into again on the next couple slides, really how that will advance your career and why that skill set is so important. So some of the career opportunities available. So as I said before, I spent 3 months, interviewing for basically every single job you can imagine that required some type of scientific degree. Some of them I wasn't interested in. However, others I was, and others I just wanted to learn about. Now, these are not all of the jobs, and these are very summarized and categorized pretty neatly. However, there are a bunch of different derivatives to these, but in my experience, they all kind of fall into one of these general categories in some way, shape, or form. So the first is going to be a support scientist. And you see it has an asterisk there. If there's an asterisk there, that means it's actually a position that I've held. And then I'm on the next slide, I'm going to go into kind of what the individual aspects of those 3 specific positions are. So for a support scientist, those go by many different names, and I'm sure you guys have all worked with them or seen the names. They go by technical support scientist, sales support specialist, sales support scientist, product specialist. There's a bunch of different names, but they're all generally the same thing. And your general role in that is to assist sales and customer service teams with the management of scientific clientele, acting as a subject matter expert to provide a client with the best service possible. So typically what that means is maybe there's a salesman who's really good at selling, but he's never taken a science course in his day and in his lifetime, but he's selling to scientists. So his job is to be the salesman and the communicator who closes the deal. However, your job as a scientist is to come in and speak the lingo and be the quote unquote engineer of the deal to give the researcher that you're selling to or the researcher that you're working through, through a problem with some peace of mind that they're speaking to someone who knows what they're talking about. Now, when it comes to support scientists, you are going to travel quite a bit, or you can travel quite a bit, but I'm going to get into that on the next slide, actually, so I'll stop there. However, now moving on, we also have financial scientists. This was something that did pique my interest. I realized quite quickly that it was not for me because I'm not the greatest at math, and obviously this role would require a lot of math. However, in this sense, you'd actually serve as a consultant to investment firms on the validity of the impact of science or of the impact of a scientific organization's research and potential ROI. Essentially, what that means is, maybe it'll be Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, even a smaller investment firm. What they typically do is they'll hire people out of college with either a master's or a PhD, and they'll hire you out of college or maybe a little bit afterwards, and they hire you for your expertise. Now, the reason why they hire you for your expertise is not because of your financial expertise, obviously. It's more of your scientific acumen. Now, what they use you for, and a lot of times they do hire you out of college so that they can build you up. So that is one thing I learned about that role, or at least if not out of college, relatively earlier in your career. And what they'll do is they'll take you in and they'll train you on the financial side, but they want to utilize you to help them make decisions about their investments. So for example, say Goldman Sachs, extreme example, but we'll use them. Say Goldman Sachs is looking to invest in a small biotechnology company. Now, as you guys know, most biotechnology companies, some do produce revenue, but others don't. Others are in the research phase and with the hope of producing massive revenue in the future. So for investment companies, this becomes an issue because when you're investing in a company, you look at things like their funding, their return on investment, their revenue stream, their cash flow, how many shares they have outstanding, things like that. However, it's difficult for the people who are experts in that to also be experts in the scientific part of it. So say Goldman Sachs is investing in a small biotechnology company, they'll have somebody look at the numbers, but then they'll come to you as a scientist to look at the actual research and determine if the research or the drug development or the experiments that they're performing are valid and are a good investment and can actually produce a return financially in the future. So this was a pretty cool position. I did interview for one or two positions. Just wasn't really for me, but it was really cool exposure, and it's really cool kind of knowing that position's out there. Now, next, move on to a standard kind of salesman. For those of you who work in the lab, I'm sure you've been exposed to these a million times. I was, in fact, one of those salesmen who would bother you during experiments and walk into your laboratory and try and sell you things. So I do apologize on behalf of all salesmen if you've ever been interrupted during an experiment by a knock on your door with someone trying to sell you consumables. However, when it comes to salesmen, that is a little bit of a unique role in that you combine your scientific knowledge with your communication skills. As I mentioned before, your communication skills are going to be one of the most important skill sets that you can develop. So if you can combine great communication skills with scientific knowledge, you have a really unique skill set in that sense. And if you're able to put a little bit of a sales edge on that, you can then sell either equipment, reagents, even complex multi-million dollar pieces of machinery to scientists and to research organizations to help better their science and to help improve the bottom line of the company that you work for. Now, because on the next slide, I'll get into a little bit more of what that entails. Now, next we have scientific business relations. This is generally what I do now. This is a very overarching term. I couldn't think of a better term to describe it. But essentially, what this means is you're you're in more of a business development role. However, you use your scientific acumen to have business-minded conversations. So what does that mean? Essentially, you use your skill set, your scientific skill set, to advance company objectives. Now, these objectives could be partnering with another scientific entity or the development of new scientific products and marketing campaigns. So for example, if you join a company and there's a marketing team and they want to market something to scientists, there's a good chance that nobody on that marketing team has worked in a laboratory. They've probably got a degree and built their career in marketing. So what they'll do is they'll call you in, and they might call you in and they'll rely on you to say, hey, does this marketing campaign look good? Would you care if you were in a lab and you read this? Or can you read this over? Does this make sense if you were reading this as a scientist? Additionally, as I said, they could use you to partner with another scientific entity. So if you're, say your business wants you to expand a relationship and you want to have a third-party vendor look at your cells, or you just want to partner with them in general, that's where you would have to have a conversation with them. Now, you're going to use your business acumen to close the deal and get the most favorable terms that you can. However, you're also going to have to use your scientific acumen to have the conversation about the things that you want to have a conversation about. For example, somebody in business, if you're speaking, somebody who has a traditional business degree might be able to negotiate, but say you're negotiating the price of a PBMC, peripheral blood mononuclear site, there's a good chance that businessman who has only been educated in business won't even know what PBMC stands for. So that's why it's a little bit of a unique role in this sense, where you use both your business side and your science side to have the conversations needed, but you use your business side to get the business objective done. And then lastly, we have scientific writer. Now there's a bunch of different kind of terms for this role. You could be a freelance writer, scientific editor. They even have ones for more marketing geared, but essentially they're all kind of the same thing. And that is that you're either a salaried or a contract writer responsible for providing literature and material for purposes of attracting views from scientists for purposes of marketing or brand recognition. So essentially what that means is, say a company wants to put out a piece that is maybe geared toward a researcher or geared toward scientific personnel. They would then contract you, or if you or work for them full time, they would give you the assignment of writing this article geared towards scientists who are going to find it interesting, who are going to relate to the information in there because it was written by a fellow scientist. So these are the kind of general positions that I have been exposed to. Again, there are a lot of derivatives that these can break off to, but they're all generally fall into one of these categories in some way, shape, or form. Now, career insight. So as I said before on the last slide, there were 3 positions that I did actually hold. So I'm not going to speak to the ones that I didn't hold because I only interviewed for them and I did research on them. I never actually worked in them, so I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing that. But what I can share is the positions that I did work in. So the first one I had was support scientist. This was kind of my first breakout role into the business side of science when I left the laboratory. As I said, I spent 3 months searching for jobs. I landed on OHouse and they hired me as sales support scientist. I had no idea what that meant up until I actually began the job. But it was, one of the coolest experiences of my life, and I'm very glad I did. So the first thing I will say is that it's excellent for developing a business skill set. With this role specifically, it does typically serve as a stepping stone type role for people who do want to leave a laboratory. And I don't say that generally. Most colleagues that I know who have left the lab end up in this type of role. Again, they have a bunch of different names, but they're all generally the same. And from what I've seen, this is the stepping stone role. It's excellent for developing a business skill set because you're in a supporting role. So even though you're not, the main point of contact for a client, you're still speaking with clients and you're watching somebody who is the main point for the client speak to the client. And if you're able to absorb these skill sets and you're able to absorb the way they speak, absorb the way they send emails, and absorb the way that they generally go about their business, you'll be able to kind of take that on as your own and develop your own business skill set. Additionally, this role is very commercially focused. It is often with a quota-like objectives assigned. So this was a harsh reality for me, which I'll get into on the next slide, is that in a lab, there's objectives, but the objectives aren't as strict. As soon as you go into the commercial side and sales is attached, immediately there's a quota and you have to hit that quota. So I didn't even know what the word quota meant until I left the laboratory. So as soon as I got my first one, I was like, what the heck is this? Now, in addition for support scientists, and one of the reasons why it is a pretty good stepping stone for those who do want to leave a laboratory is that a lot of support scientists role do require travel. In fact, it is more rare to find one that doesn't than to find one that does. And the reason for that is because a company might have 20 salesmen, but they'll only have five or six support scientists. So you have to travel out to sites, travel out to labs, set up equipment, perform demos, go to trade shows, and all that good stuff to help further the company. Now, regarding travel, mine was a little bit extreme. In 2019, I took upwards of like 45, 50 flights. That was a lot for me, and that's why I did end up leaving that job. It sounds cool until you're brushing your teeth in the airport, 3 times a week. However, for those, it was great in the beginning because I was stuck in a lab and all I wanted to do was get out and do things. So I went from a lab to traveling all around the country. Now that's why this role is a really great stepping stone because it really helps to get that angst out of, oh man, I've been in a lab, I want to do something else. You start this role, you're in it for a year, and then you pretty much get that out and you've seen things that you want to see and experience some things that you want to experience. Additionally, the support scientist role has exposure to many different research projects in that, because you're a support scientist and you're helping your clients, get where they want to get, you're going to have a lot of different opportunities to be exposed to their research, what they're working on, and what scientific projects they have. Now, moving on to salesmen. Salesmen, now, as I said before, personality is just as important as your scientific knowledge. I'm a little bit more extroverted. If you're introverted, maybe salesman isn't for you. You definitely do have to have a little bit more of that kind of cliche salesman edge to you. Not saying you have to be, like out of a movie, but you do have to have that kind of salesman finesse to you. There's just no way around it. Additionally, there is a stark contrast, not contract, between a lab's acceptance of failure and a business's need to hit quota. Meaning that when you're in a lab and you perform an experiment and it fails, yeah, people might be disappointed with you if you made a mistake or if you wasted reagents, but there's a general acceptance that you're going to try again and you'll get it right at some point. Whereas one of the realities I had as being a salesman was that there is no kind of room for failure in that sense. They give you a quota, you're expected to hit it. If not, they reprimand you, if not let you go entirely. So that was a pretty big difference between the lab and the business side in that sense, and something that I learned pretty quickly. Also, you have an exposure to many different research projects in this as well, kind of the same as a support scientist. And lastly, salesmen can be extremely lucrative. In my experience, this is at the higher levels, is probably one of the most lucrative things you can do with your scientific degree. The only reason for that is because, as many of you know, scientific equipment can be very expensive. So if you're selling a car, now when you're selling cars, when you're selling lab equipment, it's still a general industry standard on the same amount of commission. The only difference is the average car goes for maybe 30,000. If you're a good salesman and you work your way up in the scientific industry, and say you're selling next-gen sequencers, your average sale is $500 to $1 million, or even more if you're selling things like NMRs, flow cytometers, whatever the case. So this is a pretty lucrative career at the highest level. You can start to make some really big bucks in commission and just general base salary as well. And then moving over to business relations. This requires a cumulative knowledge of a business process. This is not something that I think you can get into immediately upon leaving a lab. This is going to require a little bit more of a solid business foundation. However, in this role, you serve as almost like a consultant to your company in terms of scientist needs and wants. As I mentioned before, they'll pull you into marketing campaigns, they'll pull you into product campaigns, they'll just ask you general questions. So your job is to kind of be the quote unquote science guy. Now, some companies have several of these people, and that's perfectly fine. Or some companies have a full-time, staff scientist who takes over a lot of those roles. So there is a little bit of flexibility here, but generally, it's a pretty even distribution in this role between business and science. Now, in this role, also, you can be client-facing, you can also be behind the scenes, or you can be both. So support scientists and salesmen are usually strictly client-facing. Business relations is when you start to kind of take a step back and go into a true kind of, email behind a computer type role. And if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll address them at the end. I think we only have about maybe 4 slides left. So maybe about 10 minutes will be done, and I'll address any of the questions that you may have. So now to the fun part, some of the harsh realities that I had upon making the transition. The first harsh reality I had was that unless taken as an elective or self-taught, most scientists have extremely limited exposure to business education. For those of you who, in here do work in a laboratory, I'm sure you guys had a similar experience to me. You guys probably never took an accounting course. You probably never took a course on how to balance a spreadsheet, or a course on business relations, or how to close a deal, or how to draft an MSA or a CDA or an NDA. There's a million different things that you have to kind of learn. Now, a lot of those you do learn when you do, get into the industry as a scientist, because you are working for a business. So you do have to kind of learn those terms a little bit. But for the most part, it's a pretty stark contrast between what you need to know when you're in a business role as opposed to what you can learn on your own. Now, in order to combat this, you really, at least I had to be able to absorb as much from the business environment as I absolutely could, and be as dedicated as I possibly could to acquiring those skill sets. Now, there's a few ways to go about this. I'm sure many of you are much more studious than I am, and actually would educate yourself. I kind of took the layman's approach to it. And what I would do is I would sit there in meetings and boardrooms and Anytime that a term came up that I didn't know, I would just Google it. And it turns out if you do that enough times, you actually end up learning quite a bit. So for about a year and a half of my life, Google was my best friend. And that's just kind of how I learned. However, there are articles you can read, resources you can read. There's much better ways to learn on that sense. I just did it that way because I figured it was the most relevant to me, and that's just how I retain information the best. Now, the second part, and this is my personal favorite, is that people are going to assume you are a nerd. And I don't mean that meanly. I'm a nerd myself. I love, I love kind of the nerdy atmosphere. I love science. However, when you're working in business, you're surrounded by people who typically stop taking science after high school, or maybe they had, that one freshman biology course and never really thought about it again. Now, typically, when you get into an industry where you're surrounded by people who aren't in science, they might look at you as though you are a little bit of a nerd, you are a little bit of an introvert. And maybe it is because of the way that, TV and movies portray scientists. There's always a mad scientist, there's always an experiment, there's always something going on. And, or there's, they're always this academically minded, crazy person. But in reality, we're not like that. As you guys, as the people on this call know, we're not like that. But once you leave the lab and you're not surrounded by other scientists, you're not surrounded by other like-minded scientific people do look at you a little bit as that nerdy guy, or you're the science guy who, spent the last 3 years of his life in a room with white walls and the hum of equipment. So just, that's just something that I wanted to put out there. It's not exactly an obstacle. And it's really up to yourself. It's really up to you to kill that stigma and present yourself as a business professional. But in my personal experience, even to this day, you still kind of get that stigma. And that's funny, actually. It's saying when they call me Bill Nye the Science Guy, and you still kind of have that nerdy stigma attached to you. You just kind of learn to love it. Another harsh reality is that the world moves a lot more quickly outside of a lab. Now, typically, research projects are designed over the course of months to years. For example, at Sanguine, when we design studies, our shortest studies are typically 3 months, where their longest studies can go, 1 to 2 years. And then you have data analysis after that, conclusions, redraws. There's a lot of different things that go into that can extend timelines. Now, when you move to commercial projects, those are planned in weeks to quarters. So it's a much different contrast on how much time you have to get something done, and what they're expecting from you in terms of your work ethic and your ability to complete tasks on time. And then lastly, and I don't have any notes for this one because I think it speaks for itself, everything is out of your comfort zone. Just accept that now. For those of you who are thinking about transitioning out of a laboratory, once you make that transition, you're going to feel very overwhelmed, and you're going to feel like, you went from a laboratory where you felt like a genius and you knew all this stuff to a new environment where you don't really know anything in the business world. So just accept it, accept the fact that you're out of your comfort zone, and kind of learn to love it, learn to embrace it, and learn to create your own comfort zone where, you do know things, but you're also able to use your scientific acumen to help better advance your own career. Now that I went through the harsh realities, let's go through the pleasant realities. So the pleasant realities, one of the first things that I found was that, and this was a pretty great pleasant reality, is that nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepares you more for failure than that of working in a laboratory. For those of you who work in a laboratory, as I said before, everything fails all the time. It's just the nature of experiments, and you look for that 1 or 2 times it works, then you validate it and you just repeat it for the rest of your life. Now, when you get used to that type of failure, failing in business, where failing is not more common, doesn't have that bite as much as it normally did, or as much as it should. Losing deals, facing criticism, the making of mistakes in general is just easier to accept, because you've accepted the fact that you failed in experiments, you've messed up in experiments, you've had things go wrong already. So it's nice that you kind of have that ability and you have that tough skin. Now, another point and another pleasant reality was that you can be, and most likely are, the expert in the room. Now, as I mentioned before, due to the nature of scientific material, it's generally difficult for those who were not formally educated to become scientifically competent. Now, I'm not saying that, just because you never took science in college doesn't mean you can't learn these things. You absolutely can, if you put the effort forth and you commit to learning. What I'm saying is that the ability to speak fluently in it, the ability to have a true conversation, scientist to scientist, that's a skill set that you do have to build up over years. You do have to go to school for, you do have to be formally educated on it. So because of that, when you join a company, they typically, if you join a company where maybe scientists are not the people that they hire often, and maybe you're, one of a few scientists, which is pretty common to be quite frank. Once you're in that, they're going to look to you as the expert in the room. So if you're sitting around a board table and they're talking about a new product that they're going to launch to scientists, they're going to turn to you and say, how would you use it? Would you use this in a lab? Does it excite you? So that was a pretty cool reality, especially when I first left the laboratory. And I was not down on myself, but I was like, man, I don't know if I could do this. I don't know. This is tough. I'm gonna have to go back to a laboratory. I don't know if I can pick up the business acumen. And then you realize that people come to you as the expert. It's not the other way around. So that was kind of a cool aha moment in the business world, where I kind of realized that, wow, maybe I do have a spot here. Maybe I can actually help this company. The next pleasant reality was that science is a larger part of your life than would be expected. So when I first left the laboratory, in my mind, I was like, oh man, that's it. I'm leaving the lab. I'm never going to pick up a pipette again. Science is gone. I'm going to be looking at spreadsheets and sales and revenue figures for the rest of my life. I found out that wasn't true. Even though you do not report to a lab every day, scientific conversations and the ability to speak about science and the designing of experiments and all that stuff is still an integral part of your everyday life. Even if you're a salesman, you still have the end goal of closing the sale. But at the same time, you also have the ability to speak to the scientists about their science and use those buzzwords and use your terminology and use your education. If you're a support scientist, you might end up going to an actual client's laboratory and helping refine their experiment on the piece of equipment that you just sold them or on the reagents that you just sold them. So you're definitely still involved in science a lot more than I thought you originally would be. That was a really pleasant reality and something that I'm still grateful for to this day, quite frankly. And then lastly, the scientific industry is much smaller than expected. This goes without saying. When it's science is definitely a very ancestral industry, meaning that scientists will just jump from one large pharma to another pharma, one small biotech to a large pharma, vice versa. Just kind of how it is. Same thing on the other side of the lab bench. So when you're in the business world, there's only a handful of companies that sell equipment. I'm sure most of you can probably write them down on a piece of paper without even thinking about it right now. And there's only a handful of companies that create reagents and a handful of companies that do sequencing. So it's a relatively small industry in the sense that, within about a year or two, you'll have a general idea of all the companies in the space, what they do, what they sell, what the roles are that are available to you, which is great because that means that once you kind of get your feet wet, whether it be a support scientist role or a salesman or whatever it is that you start, within 1 to 2 years, you'll be able to pivot and actually pursue something that piques your interest, whether it be marketing or if you're not in sales, maybe you'll go to that. So that was a really cool reality. And also what's great about that is it's really easy to kind of develop friendships. When you're in a lab, you don't quite commingle with other laboratories. You might if you're working on the same research or if you're in like an incubator space, but there's not as much camaraderie there between laboratories. Whereas in the business side, it's a little bit different, where there is a little bit more camaraderie and it's a little bit easier to build up networks and friends amongst the industry, which was something that I really liked and really enjoyed. 2 more slides, we'll finish up. Lastly, we have the perks. This is where I said it might kind of seem like I'm trying to sell you on leaving the laboratory. I'm not. These were just the perks that I enjoyed. There's a million perks to work in the laboratory as well, depending on your personality style and kind of which one suits you better. However, one of the perks was the travel and field work is common. As I said before, if you're a support scientist, traveling is great. If you don't like traveling, obviously that won't be a perk for you. Or if you're like me and you did like traveling and pretty much drank from the traveling fire hose, I eventually got sick of traveling quite quickly. However, the next perk is that you can acquire scientific contacts and build relationships around the world. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there's only a handful of companies in this space. And what's cool is that a lot of them are global. So, there's one day where you'll be on a call with someone in the state you live in, and the next day you'll be on a call with someone in Australia halfway around the world, having the same type of scientific conversation because they're all under the same customer base of your company that you work for. Now, the next one is also you're always working in parallel with scientific advancements. This is kind of cool because obviously with other industries, as new technologies come out, the businesses have to adapt to make sure that they're taking advantage of those technologies are not being left in the dust. Same in the scientific world, but it's a little bit different, a little bit cooler in that, when CRISPR comes out or when CRISPR came out, all of the businesses that were doing genetic work had to adjust to be able to either offer that or at least know what it is to be able to speak about it knowledgeably. Same thing with, next gen sequencing and all these new technologies that are coming out, or single cell sequencing. You basically have to educate yourself and have to become a borderline expert on these things so that and you could still retain that subject matter expert title. So that was kind of cool, in that it's not like you're focused on one scientific aspect for the rest of your life. You have the ability to build and progress with science, and then you never really get left in the dust in that sense. The next perk was the faster pace of career advancement and exposure to lucrative opportunities. In that case, when you're in a lab, career advancement can be a little bit slower. It's a little bit more of a set pace. Whereas in business, if you do well and somebody leaves, or maybe there's a position available or they bump you up, a little bit faster career advancement, not much faster, but I found it's been a little bit more hastily. And then also you have a lot more exposure to lucrative opportunities. And by that, I mean things like bonuses, KPIs. You do get bonuses when you work in a lab, and I'm sure there are KPIs attached to your performance. However, when you're in a sales organization, those bonuses do take on a little bit more of a lucrative structure, only because there's typically a quota or an actual numerical figure attached to them that correlates to a higher payout. So that was just something I found. The bonuses you get from a lab are typically a little bit smaller than the bonuses, commission, and quota achievement rewards that you would get on the business side of science, which was a nice perk. And then next, we have, once established, finding employment is never an issue. To give you an example of how secure working on the business side of science is, I switched jobs 2 times during the pandemic. One of them was actually a day after they released that unemployment was up to like 15, 20%. That is how secure this industry is. And simply, it goes back to what I said before. There's, having the ability to have a scientific skill set, but also have communication abilities, and also have the ability to, have a business acumen. You kind of become a very small subset in that sense, a very small subset of people with that specific skill set. So there's almost always a job available to you, whether or not you want to go back to a lab, or whether or not you want to continue and go to a different scientific company. Now, as I just mentioned, you can always go back to the lab. And that was a really nice perk, is that I've spoken to students, and they always say, they always, during their senior, or during the graduate students specifically, they'll come to me and they'll say, if I choose the business side, I have this, and if I choose the lab side, I have that. And they look at it very black and white, and as if it's a fork in the road that you can never go back, which is not true. If you go to the business side, and if you become a salesman or a support scientist or a financial analyst, whatever the case, as long as you have that base scientific acumen and you have the ability to work in your lab and you know how to work equipment, or even if you have worked in a lab, even better, you can always go back to a laboratory. There's always going to be a laboratory job available to you, given it might hinder your career a little bit because you took a couple of years off, but there's always that ability to go back. There's always labs looking for positions. I'm sure, as you guys have on LinkedIn, you always get the messages for like contract lab positions and things like that. Those still come to me, and if there was ever a day where I did want to go back to a lab for a year or two, it'd be a relatively easy transition in that sense. So that was always great to kind of have that knowledge that I didn't leave it behind entirely. It's always there if I want it. Now to the last slide, just some general takeaways. First and foremost, if you have interest, try it out. Life is short. That's just something that I kind of, that was kind of my mindset when I left and I had that 3 months unemployed. I was like, screw it. I only live once. If I never try working outside of a laboratory, I'll never know what it's like. And I'm glad I did. And it's one of the pivotal moments of my life, and it's something that I don't regret. Now, additionally, there's always ways to still be involved in lab work and get your lab fixed. That was something that I missed. That's something you don't realize you're going to miss. When I did leave the laboratory about a year or 2 in, I was like, man, I would kill to touch a pipette, which sounds funny because for most of you who do work in a laboratory, you touch pipettes every day. You're probably sick of them, sick of calibrating them, sick of the mistakes. I actually missed them. So how I combated that is I actually became a professor. So I'm in the lab with students working on experiments, but you can also get that fixed through equipment demonstrations or through reagent demonstrations, or working with clients on their research and actually spending time in their lab. So even though you leave the lab, there are ways to still kind of get that fix and that true kind of hands-on mechanical scientific feel again. And then lastly, and probably the most important before I wrap up, is don't be afraid to ask for help. I am very stubborn. I hate asking people for help. However, I learned very quickly that when you go into an industry that you have no experience on, that you've never taken a class on, you do need to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask somebody what ROI means. And that was a real thing that I asked somebody at one point. I asked them, what does ROI mean? Or don't be afraid to ask the difference between revenue, cost, price, and all those other things. There are things that people want to help you, and you're better off asking and knowing than not knowing and being in a meeting and then being caught in a position where you can't answer knowledgeably. And then lastly, and along the lines of help, I'll share my LinkedIn information after this. If any of you are considering the transition, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk you through some things and give you some, more in detail insight than what I presented today. However, please reach out. I've helped students and I've helped other professionals with this transition. I'd be happy to offer some guidance to you as well. With that, I would like to wrap up. So I say thank you so much for your time. I think it ended up being about 40 minutes, so I do apologize. But I'd like to open it up for any questions.
All right, Bill, thank you so much for that presentation. And like you said, yes, it's time for us to get into our questions. And we're going to start with our first question. What are some transferable skills as a lab researcher that can help with the business side of science?
So for some of the transferable skills, I would say I kind of went through it a little bit in the sense of your ability to adapt to failure. Also, your ability to adapt in general. So one of the bigger skill sets was that in science, when an experiment fails, obviously you start to look through everything and you unknowingly develop a very strong skill set of both troubleshooting and the ability to adjust and redesign experiments. That transfers very well to the real world. Even if you're doing a marketing campaign, if that fails, you already have that skill set and that process in your mind of how you're going to work your way back and how you're going to troubleshoot that, and then how you're going to implement new techniques and new abilities in that sense. Additionally, attention to detail, that's a skill set that when you're in a lab, you develop very strongly, and that just carries you for the rest of your life. So those are two skill sets that I got, there's a bunch of them, but I do want to get to some other questions, but those are two of the primary skill sets that I would say are definitely transferable and will help you.
All right, thank you. Our next question is an MBA necessary to transition out of lab-oriented work to the business side of biotech?
That's an excellent question. I was actually on the phone with somebody yesterday and they asked me the exact same question. The answer is no. However, it does help significantly. I do not have an MBA. I just kind of joined it and I built up my kind of business acumen independently of an MBA. I do have other colleagues who do have both an MBA and a master's or a PhD in science. However, what I can say is that your most valuable asset, as I said on one of the earlier slides, is your scientific knowledge. Your business, like when you're getting hired for a business position, they're not hiring you for your business acumen. So they don't really, having an MBA is great and you'll definitely, be a boost in the hiring process if you do have one. But all they really care about is that you're a scientist and that you're strong in that skill set, and the business acumen will come. So to answer your question in short, it's helpful, but no, you do not need one. I've never had one. I know a lot of colleagues who don't have one and are in a similar position to myself.
Okay, great. Our next question is, in the beginning of this transition, how do you sell yourself to show that you're ready? What are some key skills that are needed?
Good question. I'd say some of the skills. So the one thing I will say is that you do kind of have to convince a company to take a chance on you. Now, I'm not saying like take a chance on you. It's not as dramatic as that sounds. However, you do have to sell yourself a little bit in the sense to show that you are ready. So, it's an excellent question. And I'd say the thing that you really can do is don't present yourself as something that you're not. Go in there with definitely have confidence in yourself and have confidence that you are the expert in the room and that you know more about science than almost anybody in that room, which is always a nice feeling to have. But you also have to be able to to take a step back and tell them what you don't know and say, listen, this is what I'm really good at. These are the skills I want to develop. Is there a common ground where I can develop with you? And, I can also help your company in a scientific aspect. So I'd say, to answer your question in short, it's a combination of both confidence in the skill set that you've acquired and the skill sets that you have, confidence in your communication skills, but also the ability to take a step back and be very transparent on the skills that you do need to develop. And a lot of companies I've found when I was interviewing in the beginning, they're more willing to work with you in that sense because they understand that you know where you need to improve, as opposed to you're just coming in kind of willy-nilly and you're going to see where it is. You know what you have to work on, you know what you're good at, and you know what you have to improve and you know what you have to perfect. So that's kind of my piece of advice for that.
All right, thank you. Now, this is our last question for the day. And this question is, which one of these careers would be able to be done remotely?
That's an excellent question. I'd say pretty much all of them. The only one that can't be done remotely is probably the financial analyst, typically because when you do work for a financial firm, especially if you're in New York or something like that, you probably do have to report to an office. However, all of the other ones, for the most part, are a combination of either remotely or you have a territory. So like if you're a salesman or a support scientist, typically those jobs you might report to an office, but since COVID, things have changed quite a bit. So you probably will end up working from home a few days, then going out to a client site or hopping on a plane and traveling somewhere. Business relations, same thing. You might report to an office, but for the most part, they're all remote. I am full-time remote myself in my position. So to be honest, pretty much all of them, with the exception of the financial one, and even that I'm not too sure on, even some of those might be remote now, can be remote, which is a really nice perk of not having to trek to a lab every day or just trek to an office in general.
All right, thank you so much. So that concludes our webinar. Do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to share with our audience before we finish up?
No, thank you. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope I helped. I hope that, for those of you who are considering the transition, I hope this gives a little bit of clarity. And again, if you guys have any questions or just want to have just want to call me, I'll send my LinkedIn information to all of you in an email after this. And please reach out if you want, to further discuss this in more detail. But thank you all so much and have an excellent weekend.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. And thank you everyone for joining us in today's webinar. For our upcoming webinars and to request samples, you can visit sanguinebio.com. Thank you everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.